Echoes in the bayou. They say the past never truly dies in Louisiana. It festers, lingering in the humid air like a ghost with unfinished business. 20 years ago, the Davis family's name became a whispered curse. Chloe Davis, just 12 years old, woke up to a world that would never forgive or forget. It started with the disappearance of teenage girls in their sleepy parish. 6 young lives snuffed out, and her father, the quiet man who fixed their neighbors' cars, was arrested. He confessed to the killings, though the police never found all the bodies. Chloe's world shattered. The same people who once waved at her from their porches now crossed the street to avoid her. By the time she was old enough to leave town, her home was a skeleton of its former self, empty, cold, and haunted by more than memories. Now Chloe is a psychologist far from the parish, but still too close to the past. Her practice specializes in troubled teens, though she sees pieces of herself in every case file she opens. She's convinced she's made peace with her demons, even as her fiancé, Daniel, coaxes her to believe in happiness again. But as her wedding approaches, the world begins to unravel once more. News headlines flash like old nightmares. Teenage girls are disappearing again. Only this time, the vanishing act is happening in the very city Chloe calls home. And then, last night, she found a scrap of paper tucked into her car windshield. It read simply, "Chloe, it's not over." Whispers in the dark. Chloe stared at the note in her trembling hands, the words blurring as the streetlights flickered ominously overhead. It wasn't the handwriting she remembered from her father's letters, scrawled from prison. This was sharp and deliberate, the ink pressed so hard it nearly tore through the paper. Daniel's voice snapped her back to reality. "Chloe, you've been standing there forever. What's wrong?" She crumpled the note into her pocket, forcing a smile. "Nothing. Just thinking." Daniel looked at her with those warm eyes that had once felt like a lifeline. But tonight, even his presence couldn't banish the creeping sense of dread slithering through her veins. She slipped into the passenger seat of his car and locked the door out of reflex. As they drove, Chloe kept her gaze on the side mirror, scanning the darkened streets. The unease followed her home, into the cozy townhouse she and Daniel shared. She checked the locks twice and then a third time, only half listening as he rambled on about table arrangements and catering. It wasn't until she was alone in bed that the silence became unbearable. She reached for her phone and opened the news app. There it was, the headline she'd been avoiding all day. 4th teen vanishes in less than 2 weeks. The girl's name was Kaylee Summers, 15 years old. The article didn't say much, just that she was last seen leaving her friend's house. Chloe stared at Kaylee's picture, a blurry selfie of a girl with braces and a mischievous grin. It could have been her 20 years ago. A notification pinged on her phone, making her jump. It was an email with no sender listed. Subject: "Do you remember?" Body: "Check your mail." Her heart thudded painfully as she crept down the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. She hesitated at the front door, her hand hovering over the handle. When she finally opened it, the air outside was thick with the scent of rain. An envelope lay on the welcome mat, damp at the edges. Her name was written across it in the same sharp handwriting as the note from earlier. Back inside, Chloe ripped it open. A photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up with trembling hands. It was a picture of her father, taken the day of his arrest. He was sitting in the back of a squad car, his face blank and unreadable. But someone had drawn over the photo in red ink, circling his eyes and writing a single word below: "Innocent." Shadows of the past. The photograph sat on the table, daring Chloe to look away, but she couldn't. The red circled eyes seemed to follow her, searing into her memory. Innocent. The word screamed louder than anything she could rationalize. Her father wasn't innocent. He couldn't be. The evidence had been overwhelming. The discovery of the first victim in their backyard, the unaccounted for nights when her father would leave without explanation, the quiet way he confessed to every murder. But that word, it planted a seed of doubt she wasn't ready to water. Daniel's voice startled her from the kitchen doorway. "What are you doing up?" It's past midnight. Chloe fumbled to shove the photo back into the envelope. I couldn't sleep, she mumbled. Daniel's brow furrowed as he stepped closer. You look pale. Are you okay? I'm fine. The words came too quickly, brittle and unconvincing. Go back to bed. I'll be up in a bit. He hesitated but eventually nodded, retreating upstairs. As soon as she heard the bedroom door close, Chloe grabbed her phone. This wasn't something she could ignore. She opened her contacts and scrolled to the name she had saved years ago, but never called. Detective Malcolm Price. He had been the lead investigator on her father's case, and the only person who ever seemed to take pity on her family after the trial. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. Price. It's Chloe Davis, she said, her voice trembling. I need to talk to you. There was a long pause, followed by a heavy sigh. Chloe, it's been years. What's going on? They're disappearing again, she said, the words rushing out. Girls, just like before. And I got something, a note, a picture of my dad with innocent written on it. Someone's trying to tell me something. Another silence, this one weightier. Where are you? Price finally asked. She gave him her address, and he promised to come by first thing in the morning. But when Chloe hung up, the unease still clung to her like a second skin. The house was too quiet. She double-checked the locks again, then sat in the living room with every light on, the photo clutched in her hand. Her father's hollow eyes stared back at her, and for the first time, she wondered, what if the story wasn't as simple as she believed? What if her father wasn't the monster she thought he was? And then, through the silence, she heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. Her heart stilled. The clock on the wall ticked into the small hours of the morning. No one decent came knocking at this time. The knock came again, louder, and then a voice, muffled but unmistakable. Chloe, it's your father. A voice from the grave. Chloe froze, the blood in her veins turning to ice. It was impossible. Her father had been locked away for 2 decades. She had seen the trial, heard the gavel fall, and yet the voice outside the door was undeniably his. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Chloe, please. Open the door. I need to talk to you. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled backward. The photograph slipped from her trembling hands, landing face up on the floor. The voice called again, softer now. It's not safe, Chloe. Let me in. She reached for her phone, fumbling to dial 911. Her hands shook so badly, she nearly dropped it, but she managed to press the call button. The operator answered, calm and composed. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone at my door, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. They're saying they're my father. Are you in a safe location? The operator asked. Chloe pressed herself against the far wall, staring at the door. Yes, I'm inside. The door is locked. Stay where you are. Officers are on their way. The voice outside changed then, taking on an edge of desperation. Chloe, don't call them. They won't help you. You don't understand what's happening. Her grip on the phone tightened, tears burning her eyes. You're not my father, she said, louder this time, though her voice still wavered. You're not. There was a long silence. Then softly, I always knew you'd doubt me, Chloe, just like everyone else. But you have to listen. It's starting again. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the floor. What's starting? She whispered. You know what? The voice said, its tone tinged with sorrow. You know the truth, even if you've buried it. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night, and Chloe dared to peek through the window. Flashing blue and red lights illuminated the street. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car, hands on their holsters. She turned back to the door, but the voice was gone. When she opened it, there was nothing outside but the chill of the early morning air. Detective Price arrived less than an hour later. Chloe hadn't moved from the couch, the photograph still clutched in her hand. The officers had searched the property and found no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbances. I'm not crazy, she said as Price settled into the armchair across from her. I know what I heard. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I believe you, Chloe, but you need to tell me everything. Start with the note. She handed it to him, along with the photograph. He studied them in silence, his brows furrowing deeper with each passing moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. "You said the girls are disappearing again. Do you know how many?" "4," Chloe said, her throat dry. "So far." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Then we need to move fast. Because 20 years ago, there were 6. Chloe's stomach churned. "What are you saying?" Price hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I never believed your father worked alone. If he did any of it at all." Echoes in the cell. Chloe stared at Detective Price, her mind a whirlwind. "What do you mean? If he did any of it?" "He confessed. He admitted to everything." Price leaned back, rubbing his temples. "He confessed, yes. But that confession, it was too clean, too complete, almost rehearsed. And there were gaps in the evidence, things we never could explain. The other officers were eager to close the case, and your father didn't resist. It always felt wrong." Her hands gripped the edge of the couch as a cold dread crept over her. Why would he confess to murders he didn't commit? Price's eyes darkened. "That's what we're going to find out." 2 hours later, they were driving down an empty stretch of highway toward Angola Prison, where Chloe's father was serving his life sentence. The photograph and note were tucked into a folder on Price's lap, though Chloe kept glancing at it as if expecting it to vanish. Neither spoke much during the drive. Chloe's thoughts churned with 1,000 unanswered questions, but none seemed to fit together. All she could hear was her father's voice at her door, echoing in her mind. "You know the truth, even if you've buried it." When they arrived, the prison loomed ahead, a hulking fortress of concrete and steel. Chloe had been here once before, as a teenager, but she'd vowed never to return. The memory of her father, shackled and silent on the other side of the plexiglass, was etched into her mind like a scar. Inside, the air was sterile and suffocating. A guard escorted them to the visitation area, where Chloe's father, David Davis, was waiting. He looked older than she remembered, his once dark hair now a patchwork of gray, his face hollowed by time and regret. But his eyes, those eyes still held a quiet intensity that made her stomach knot. "Chloe." His voice was raspy, as if in use for years. She didn't respond, sitting stiffly in the chair opposite him. Price sat beside her, his notepad ready. "We need answers, David," Price began. "Girls are disappearing again. Same age, same circumstances as before. And someone's trying to drag Chloe into it." David's gaze shifted to his daughter, lingering on her as if seeing a ghost. "I told you this would happen," he said softly. "They never stopped." "Who never stopped?" Chloe demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "You mean the people who helped you?" "Or," she faltered, "or the ones who really did it?" David leaned forward, his cuffs clinking against the table. "I confess to protect you," he said, his tone raw. "Do you understand that, Chloe? Whoever's doing this, they wanted to hurt you, to hurt our family. I thought if I took the blame, it would end." Price's pen scratched across the notepad. "Who are they, David? Names, details, anything you've got." David shook his head. "I don't know who they are. They don't leave loose ends. All I know is they've been watching us. For years." Chloe's stomach churned. "Why now? Why start again?" David's expression was grim. "Because they know you're getting close. Closer than I ever was." The room felt colder, the fluorescent lights too harsh. Chloe leaned back, her pulse racing. Closer to what? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past her, toward the guard standing near the door. "They'll come for her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't stop them." The guard shifted uncomfortably, his hand on the radio at his hip. Price stood, snapping his notepad shut. "We're done here." As they turned to leave, David called out, his voice urgent. "Chloe, wait." She hesitated, glancing back. "Don't trust the people you think you can," he said. "Not everyone is who they seem." The circle closes. Chloe's father's warning echoed in her mind as she and Price left the prison. The drive back felt heavier, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her like a storm cloud. She stared out the window, watching the trees blur into smudges of green and black, her thoughts as tangled as the shadows in the forest. "Do you believe him?" she asked finally, her voice brittle. Price glanced at her, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. I believe there's more to the story than we ever uncovered. And if he's telling the truth about someone targeting you, he trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like a noose. Chloe shuddered and turned her gaze back to the window. He said they'd come for me, she murmured. What if they already have? Back at her townhouse, the air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. Price insisted on sweeping the house before letting her inside, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. When he finally nodded that it was clear, Chloe followed him in, her nerves stretched thin. Price took a seat at the kitchen table, spreading out his notes and the photo they'd taken from the envelope. If your father was trying to protect you, he said, then the key to all of this has to be connected to you somehow. Chloe frowned. I was a kid. What could I possibly have to do with it? Price studied her, his expression unreadable. Sometimes kids see things adults don't, things they don't even realize are important. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. A flicker of memory teased at the edges of her mind. Something small, insignificant. She couldn't place it, but it felt important, like a word on the tip of her tongue. The doorbell rang, startling them both. Chloe froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Price motioned for her to stay back as he approached the door, his gun drawn. He peered through the peephole, then lowered the weapon with a sigh. It's Daniel, he said, opening the door. Her fiancé stepped inside, looking harried and confused. What the hell is going on, Chloe? I've been trying to call you all day. She faltered, glancing at Price, who gave her a subtle nod. It's a long story. Daniel's gaze fell to the photo on the table, his brow furrowing. What's this? He asked, picking it up. It's part of what we're trying to figure out, Chloe said carefully. It's complicated. His eyes lingered on the red-circled word, innocent. Do you think he was? Chloe hesitated, unsure how to answer. I don't know. Daniel set the photo down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. Whatever this is, Chloe, we'll figure it out. Together. His words were reassuring, but something in his tone felt off. She couldn't shake the unease that prickled at the back of her neck. Later that night, after Price left, Chloe and Daniel lay in bed, the silence between them heavy. She stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, her mind replaying her father's warning over and over. Don't trust the people you think you can. Beside her, Daniel's breathing was steady, deep, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. His words from earlier echoed in her mind. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. Together. It should have comforted her. Instead, it felt like a promise she didn't want him to keep. She turned her head to look at him, but he was already staring at her, his eyes open and unreadable in the dark. Can't sleep? He asked softly. She shook her head. Daniel reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're safe with me, he said, but the words didn't feel like his own. The cracks in the mask. Chloe lay awake long after Daniel's breathing turned slow and steady again. The stillness of the room felt oppressive, the kind of silence that wasn't truly empty. Her father's warning echoed in her mind, tangled with Daniel's words. You're safe with me. She wanted to believe him. She needed to. But a quiet voice deep inside whispered something she couldn't ignore. He knows more than he's saying. The next morning, Price called early, his tone brisk and urgent. I need you to come down to the station. We've got something. Chloe's heart thudded as she glanced at Daniel, who was busy making coffee in the kitchen. What is it? She asked, keeping her voice low. I'll explain when you get here, Price said. And come alone. The line went dead. At the station, Price met her in a small, windowless room lit by a single overhead bulb. The walls were lined with case files, and a corkboard displayed photos of the missing girls, their smiling faces staring out into nothingness. We ran a search on the note, and the photo, Price began, gesturing to the folder on the table. The handwriting on the note doesn't match your father's or anyone else in our database. But the ink, it's not just regular pen ink. It's mixed with human blood. Chloe's stomach churned. Whose blood? We don't know yet. Lab results are pending. Price leaned closer, lowering his voice. But there's more. That photo? It wasn't printed recently. The paper, the ink, it's 20 years old. Chloe's breath caught. How is that possible? Whoever left it for you either had it this whole time, or he hesitated, his eyes narrowing. They were involved back then. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Chloe stared at the photo on the table, her father's circled eyes seeming to pierce through her. Do you think he was innocent? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Price's gaze didn't waver. I think he believed he was protecting you. And I think whoever he was protecting you from isn't finished. When Chloe returned home, the house felt wrong, as if someone had moved through it in her absence. Daniel was nowhere to be found, but his laptop sat open on the dining table. Chloe hesitated. She hated the idea of snooping, but the gnawing doubt in her gut wouldn't let her walk away. She approached the laptop, the screen glowing faintly. The email inbox was open. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Work emails, invoices, the mundane minutiae of life. But then she noticed a folder tucked into the corner of the screen, titled simply Davis. Her hand hovered over the trackpad. She clicked. The folder opened to reveal dozens of files. Scanned police reports, news clippings about her father's case, and photos of the missing girls, Kaylee Summers among them. Chloe's blood turned to ice as she scrolled through the files. One stood out, a grainy black and white photo of a little girl standing in front of a porch. It was her, no older than 8, smiling for the camera. Her eyes darted to the timestamp at the bottom of the photo. It was dated 2 months before the first girl disappeared. What are you doing? The voice behind her made her jump. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his expression calm. But his eyes, there was something unreadable in them. You're investigating my family? She asked, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Daniel stepped closer, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Chloe, listen to me. I can explain. Then start talking, she snapped, her heart pounding in her chest. I wanted to protect you, he said, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. To understand what you went through. That's all. Chloe shook her head, backing away. You've been lying to me. Daniel sighed, his calm facade cracking just slightly. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you everything. But it's for your own good. Her back hit the wall, and she stared at him, her mind racing. The pieces didn't fit, but one thing was certain. She didn't know the man standing in front of her. Who are you? She whispered. Daniel's expression darkened. You already know, Chloe. The mask falls. Chloe's breath hitched as Daniel stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the weak sunlight streaming through the blinds. His face remained calm, but his eyes gleamed with something dark and unreadable. Who are you? She repeated, her voice sharper this time. Daniel tilted his head, almost amused. Come on, Chloe. Think. You've been piecing it together, haven't you? The notes, the photos, the girls. Her mind spun, struggling to keep up. You're involved in this. You. Her words faltered as a horrifying realization began to take shape. Were you? Were you watching me even before we met? He smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of his lips. Not me personally, but let's just say I've been part of this longer than you think. Her knees buckled, and she pressed herself against the wall for support. Why? She whispered. Why me? Why my family? Daniel's smile vanished. He crouched slightly, so they were eye level, his expression turning cold. It's not about you, Chloe. It never was. Your father, he got in the way. He tried to stop something he didn't understand, and he paid the price. Just like you will if you keep digging. Chloe's mind reeled, flashes of memory surfacing like broken glass cutting through her thoughts. Her father's late-night disappearances, the whispers behind closed doors, the way he never seemed surprised when the police came for him. He confessed to protect me, she said, her voice barely audible. From you. Daniel straightened, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeve. Not just me. From all of us. The word hung in the air like poison. All of who? Chloe demanded, her fear giving way to anger. What is this? Daniel sighed, almost pitying. You're asking the wrong questions. You should be asking what's next. And Chloe, his voice dropped to a chilling whisper. You won't like the answer. The air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if the room itself was suffocating her. Chloe's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Daniel stepped closer, his voice soft but laced with menace. "This was never about you. It's about what you represent. What's been hidden for too long." "Hidden?" she echoed, the word trembling on her lips. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out to her. "Take it. You'll understand soon enough." Chloe stared at it, her heart pounding. "I don't want it." "You don't have a choice," he said simply, dropping the paper at her feet. Before she could react, Daniel turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps eerily calm. The front door clicked shut behind him. For a moment, all Chloe could do was stand there, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Finally, her gaze dropped to the paper on the floor. Her hands shook as she picked it up and unfolded it. It was another photograph, this one of her, taken just days ago, standing outside her office. But this time, the red ink circled not her eyes, but her mouth. Beneath it, a single word was scrawled: "Speak." The web unravels. Chloe stared at Daniel, her hands gripping the edge of the table as her mind raced to process his chilling confession. Everything, the files, the photographs, the carefully orchestrated chaos, had led back to him. But she needed to understand why. "You've been playing me this whole time," she said, her voice trembling. "But why? Why the girls? Why my family?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the twisted satisfaction beneath. "Do you really want to know, Chloe? Because once you do, there's no going back. Tell me," she demanded, anger replacing the fear that had paralyzed her moments ago. He exhaled, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Your father wasn't innocent, Chloe. But he wasn't guilty in the way you think. 20 years ago, he uncovered something, a secret buried deep in this town. Something people would kill to keep hidden." Chloe's heart thudded. "What secret?" Daniel's eyes gleamed. "There's a network, Chloe. A group of people with particular appetites. Your father stumbled onto them when he noticed the first girl had gone missing. He thought he could stop them, expose them, but he didn't realize how powerful they were." Chloe's stomach churned. "You're talking about a trafficking ring," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Smart girl," Daniel said, clapping mockingly. "Your father took matters into his own hands. He managed to save 2 girls and killed one of the lower-level members. But when the group realized he was onto them, they offered him a deal. Take the fall for the murders, and they'd leave his family alone." Chloe's breath caught. "He confessed to protect us?" Daniel nodded, his expression darkening. "But he didn't realize the group didn't like loose ends. They knew you'd eventually ask questions, start digging. So they sent me to keep an eye on you." Her blood ran cold. "And the new disappearances? Was that you?" Daniel's smile returned, sharper now. "Not entirely. I only took the first girl. The rest were necessary sacrifices. A way to keep the group in line and remind them who's in control." Chloe stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of horror and rage. "You're a monster. I'm a survivor," Daniel said simply. "Just like you." The final reckoning. Chloe's hands shook as she held the chair leg, her knuckles white. She had grabbed it moments before, desperate for something, anything, to defend herself. Across the room, Daniel stood calm and unbothered, as if they were discussing a casual disagreement. "Put that down, Chloe," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're not going to do anything." She didn't answer, her eyes darting toward the door. If she could just make it outside, she could scream for help, flag someone down, anything to get away. Daniel caught the movement and chuckled. "Don't bother. No one's coming. I made sure of that." Her stomach tightened. He wasn't lying. His calculated precision had been clear from the beginning. But then a sound broke through the tense silence. The faint wail of approaching sirens. Daniel's calm demeanor cracked, and for the first time, Chloe saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. "You call the cops," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. She didn't reply, but her grip on the chair leg tightened. Daniel lunged toward her, but Chloe swung with everything she had. The chair leg connected with his side, and he stumbled, gasping in pain. She bolted for the door, throwing it open just as a police cruiser screeched to a halt in the driveway. Detective Price jumped out, gun drawn. "Chloe," he shouted. "Stop him," she cried, pointing back at Daniel, who was staggering toward the doorway, his face twisted with rage. Price didn't hesitate. "Daniel Hart, you're under arrest." Daniel froze, his hands half raised in mock surrender. "This is a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, blood trickling from his temple. "Chloe's been under a lot of stress. She's imagining things." Price's jaw tightened. "Step outside, Daniel. Now!" When Daniel didn't move, Price advanced, his gun steady. Daniel glanced toward the back of the house, clearly weighing his chances of escape. Chloe's voice broke through the tension. "He's part of a trafficking ring. He's the one who took the girls." Daniel turned back to her, his expression venomous. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Price's gun didn't waver. "We'll see about that," he said. Backup arrived moments later, and Daniel was taken into custody. As the officers hauled him toward a squad car, he turned to Chloe, his face twisting into a cruel grin. "This isn't over," he hissed. Epilogue. Weeks later, the full extent of the trafficking ring came to light. Daniel's arrest led to the discovery of encrypted files, names of powerful people tied to the disappearances. Chloe's father was exonerated posthumously, his name cleared after decades of shame. Chloe stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters swarmed around Price. She felt a weight lift, but the scars of the ordeal lingered. Price approached her, his expression kind but tired. "You did good, Chloe. Your father would have been proud." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's over," she said, more to herself than him. "For now," Price replied, his voice tinged with caution. "But these kinds of people, they don't just disappear." Chloe met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "Neither do I." As she walked away, she felt the shadows of the past receding. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter, and she was ready for whatever came next. The end.